So welcome back. This video is kind of a stroll down memory lane for those of us who have been working with personal computers since the 80s and 90s. And the goal here is for those who might be thinking about getting back into some of this old technology and my thoughts on some of the steps you might want to take to make it as painless as possible. Because it's a nice idea and it sounds like fun, but there's some disadvantages that I think you need to consider first before you jump into it. So my goal is to try and give some steps on how best to proceed in my view. Now, I'm going to start out with a little brief history, at least my history on personal computers going back to the early 80s. And might give you guys some little insights into what was going on back then, and where the technology went and what years things were made available. And then from then we're going to take a look at how best to proceed if you want to get back into this technology. Now, first of all, I would highly recommend, if you want to look at a wonderful summary of the technology by each year it was introduced and some of the history and what the technology included for each of the devices, I would suggest you go to this website, oldcomputers.net. It is really wonderful. And it has a history, a timeline, and you can see it here on the left. It shows by year which computers were introduced starting back in 1970. And I think people would argue back in the 60s there were technically personal computers available, but this starts in the 70s with the Altair and some of the early 70s computers. And if you look at this, you might want to click Show Images, and it shows adds icons with each of those devices so you can actually see. You can see the 1975, the Altair, which people consider the first personal computer. And you can see as the years go on, you get the Commodore PET. In 77, you get the Apple II and the Commodore PET and the Radio Shack Trash 80. And time goes on, you get more and more computers. So my history is back in early 1980s, maybe 1980, 81. Heathkit came out with a computer called the H89, which was an all-in-one computer. And the reason this kind of sparked my attention, I believe, was, if you recall Heathkit, it was a build-it-yourself technology. Heathkit had a lot of, you could build an oscilloscope. You buy an oscilloscope package, and you have to solder all the connections onto the motherboard and turn it on and hope it works. So that's what I did with this Heathkit H89. They send you the case and the CRT and the motherboard and all the pieces, and you have to solder them together. And you can see it came with this operating system called Heathkit DOS, I recall. It came with an assembler and Benton Harbor Basic, which is an assembler and basic programming language. And this is where I got my start doing assembly, because as you can see, it's basically a command line. There was no Windows back then. So you basically everything was command line, and you can write your code in assembler. And one of the nice things about working on technology back then was you're dealing with everything down on the hardware level. So you get a very good understanding of actually what the software is doing and how it relates to the hardware. And unfortunately nowadays, everything has been abstracted to such a high user-friendly level that it's all about pressing buttons. And computer experts now are those who know which buttons to push. And unfortunately, that's really not knowing stuff. That's kind of just repeating what you've seen. So here was, back then, one of the benefits was you could actually deal with stuff on a very low level and know what's going on. So that's one reason why people might want to get back into this old technology, because you can actually work at, this says it allows the user to operate at machine level or use the system without disk drives or cassette tape. So it's really nice way to learn the basics of the technology. So that's the Heathkit H89, and you can see you've got the motherboard and you've got the CRT, and you had to solder all this stuff together and put it together. And that was the first computer I had back in early 1980s. From then, it went to middle of 1980s. Let's scroll down to my next one, which was 1984, I believe. Right after the Apple Lisa came out, we had the, this was the same time, oh, here we go, we have the Apple Macintosh, and this was my second computer. And at the time, the Macintosh was like a huge deal because it was this beautiful windowing user interface, and you could draw things. And, you know, the difference between this and the command line on the Heathkit was, you know, light years ahead. So I believe I purchased this, and unfortunately, as this mentions, released in January of 1984 with 128K of RAM, it quickly became obvious that this was insufficient, so 8 months later, Apple released an updated version, unofficially referred to as the Fat Mac, with 512K, or 4 times as much RAM. By that time, I was so fed up with the 128K RAM limit, you really couldn't do much at all with it. It was absolutely horrendous. And the price they wanted for the update was just, my jaw dropped when I saw it. So I got very disillusioned with Apple at the time, and I ended up selling it right as the Fat Mac was coming out. I said, this is ridiculous. So ever since then, I've been kind of biased against Apple for their prices, and you know, things are so difficult and so specialized with the Apple computers. So anyway, that's my next step was in late 80s, early 90s. I finally decided to buy a Commodore Amiga 2000. Here's the Amiga 2000, and one of the reasons I bought it, I think it was in early 90s, was because it came with, in September of 1990, NewTek ships the Video Toaster, a hardware-software real-time video effects tool for the Amiga 2000. And at the time, it was $1,600, which is a boatload of money, but I bought it. And one of the reasons was it came with the Lightwave 3D software, which was at the time a fairly high-level, almost professional-grade 3D modeling and rendering software, and this real-time video editor called the Video Toaster. So it was really kind of impressive that you could buy on your desktop, you could buy a 3D modeling and rendering software and also a video editing software and hardware. So I believe early 90s I bought the Video Toaster and the Amiga 2000. So I was a great fan of the Amiga 2000, but honestly, I kind of lost track. I believe I sold it in the mid-90s, but I honestly don't remember why I sold it or when I sold it or anything about that. But just recently, in the last couple of weeks, I saw a video. I stumbled on a video somehow of someone who was refurbishing one of these old Amiga 2000s. And I thought, wow, here's the motherboard. And apparently they've got we'll discuss a problem later where they have a battery that leaks and causes damage over the years. But I saw this repair video of a guy doing a refurbishment of the Amiga 2000, and I said, wow, I haven't thought about that in years. You know, maybe I want to go out and get me one of those Amiga 2000s and start playing with it. Hopefully one with a video toaster, because I barely remember exactly what it had, but as I recall, it was pretty cool at the time. So I started out doing probably the worst thing you can do, and that is starting looking around to see if I could buy a video toaster with an Amiga 2000. So I was directed to eBay, and I was surprised because eBay is kind of, I thought eBay died 5 or 10 years ago. eBay is kind of a nothing now, replaced by Amazon and some others. But apparently there's still people selling stuff on eBay, and I looked around and there's very little available for the Amiga 2000. And one of the problems that I want to mention right off the bat with some of these computers is that they're old. And here is just an example for the Amiga 2000 motherboard. If you look down here on the bottom, there's a battery. And it was made by Vartech, I think. And it's very commonly known in the Amiga community that this battery had problems leaking over the years. And it would leak acid into this board, and it would damage the 68000 or 68020 microprocessor right here, and it would affect these other components down here, and it would corrode, and it could break the traces on the board, and really did a horrendous amount of damage. So it was interesting to watch somebody who was trying to refurbish this, because you spent hours and hours and days working on this in little tiny detail and having to remove stuff and resolder and find replacement components and spend a lot of money and a lot of time and figure out how to clean this. And it was really a huge task. So yeah, you can do that. But what I'm recommending is, instead of jumping immediately into the hardware, and I think this goes for any old computer, maybe step back a bit and think about other ways you can dip your feet in and learn about and maybe redo your memories a little bit differently, so you're not taking such a risk. Because the other thing I found is, these components, I thought they'd be fairly low priced, but this keyboard I saw for $150 on eBay, up to $200. And I saw a Amiga 2000 computer for $500, just the computer. And the problem is, since these things are so old, people are very hesitant to tell you what the real condition is. They just say user assumes all responsibility. So, it could have no motherboard, it could have no chips, it could have no power supply, it could have no keyboard, no mouse. You'd have to find those and pay big money for those. So again, I think you need to be very wary before you jump in and start buying hardware. And specifically for the Amiga 2000, what I found was that there is a really wonderful, what's called an emulator, where you can buy this emulator. It's only like $30, and you can download it onto your Windows computer, and you can basically start up just about any version of the Amiga operating system and what was called the Workbench in a window on your Windows machine and actually run it. And it's really kind of incredible. It's called Amiga Forever. And you go to amigaforever.com, and the company that runs it is Cloanto. And apparently there's been, even now, 30 years later, there's been copyright issues, and apparently Cloanto is the actual owner of the Amiga software, the copyright to the Amiga software. So if you want to get the real stuff, and I strongly recommend you go here and you spend $30, because they give you so much for this. And personally, I am very much against people who pirate software. I think it's ridiculous. Instead of spending a lot of money on hardware, at least try it out first and see if you lose interest in a few days or a week, or if you actually get more interested. So I would go to amigaforever.com and purchase what's called the Plus edition of Amiga Forever. It gives you tons of stuff. Again, it allows you to start up each version of the Amiga operating system on your computer. It also gives you a bunch of games and different software that was available with the different versions. So again, I strongly recommend $30, download it. And what you will get is this. Once you install it and start running it, you will get this interface, Amiga Forever Plus Edition. And it lists the systems, so you can, it's got like an Amiga 1000, 2000, Amiga 500, 3000, 500 plus, I don't know what the CDTV, Amiga 1200, 4000, it's got 4000 PowerPC, and it's got the Workbench 1.3, Workbench 3.1, which is a more recent one, Amiga Sys. So all these different versions from different years, you can just basically double click, and I'll do that, double click on the Amiga 2000, and you can see it actually starts up the Amiga 2000 operating system. And it takes a while. It simulates the actual starting, where it simulates the floppy drive starting up. And it's really interesting. I mean, so here's the here's the Workbench release 1.3 on the Amiga 2000, and you can see it takes a long time to start up. It's got the original command line interface 2, and here we go. We've got Workbench 1.3 on a window on our computer, and you can, right now I've got it full screen, but you can make it, bring it down to another screen. And then you've got utilities, and you've got your clock, you've got all of this, calculator. And to get out of this, you just hit F12 and quit, and you go back to your interface with the Amiga Forever. And you can do the same thing, for example, Workbench 3.x, which is a much newer version, and it's got associated with it a ton of software you can run. So I'm going to click on that. And here you go with Workbench 3.x. And if you go down to the bottom here, you can see these different software titles that you can run associated with that. So for example, Personal Paint. You may remember Deluxe Paint was one of the paint softwares, but this is a newer version called Personal Paint. And you click on it, it basically starts up this paint program. Pretty cool. So depending on the version, you get all these different operating systems and workbenches. And they also give you, for example, you click on games, they've got a whole ton of games. Now, I've never played video games. I have no interest in video games. I'm surprised that they're so popular. But anyway, they got a whole bunch of video games you can start up. They've got demo scenes you can start up, and let's start up Animotion, whatever that is, and see what it gets you. But basically, it's all point and click, all of this stuff, and it starts up 1.3 Workbench. And it makes your screen go goofy, and I think that's just while it's starting up. And there you go. You've got Animotion, whatever this is. So it's got fancy 3D effects. So for those who are working on 3D, here's some of the beginnings in the 80s and 90s of 3D rendering. And we're going to be getting into that in one of my other series. Ray tracing animation was done by my own renderer called okay, you click on left click on that and you get another one comes up. You get a rotating cube and you can see it's got backface culling and you can see transparency, and so it's pretty cool. You know, this stuff was back in the 80s that people were doing this original 3D stuff, and here we are 30, 40 years later working on ray trace renderers, and you know, this is the very beginnings of it. So it's kind of interesting. So I'll quit out of that, and so you can see then they give you a gallery of stuff, and you can see previews down the bottom. They got some videos of some of the history of the Amiga. But honestly, I think this is by far the best way to start out with your investigating stuff like the Amiga. and the Amiga 2000 because it's so easy to do. You just click and run it and you're all set. Now, if you want to get more, if you've done this, I suggest you do this in the first place as the minimal step. If you've done this and you want to get into more hardware-based stuff, just keep in mind it's going to take some work. This is not drag and drop stuff. It's going to take some work, and you're going to be in it for a while. What I did is I decided that maybe I would look into putting an Amiga operating system on my Raspberry Pi. And I did a video a while back, a year or so ago, showing how to set up the Raspberry Pi. And that's basically a $40, I think, and it's really an incredible computer. It's basically like a desktop computer, but it's only $40, fits in your hand. And you can see I've got the keyboard and mouse hooked up in USB ports, my HDMI going to my monitor, and then this power supply from a USB power supply. And what I did was I installed some of the software on my Raspberry Pi to run the Amiga Workbench. Now, again, it's going to take some effort because there are ways to do it, but you're going to have to do stuff like if you're familiar with the Raspberry Pi, you're going to have to make another SD card, a micro SD. So you're going to have to find a way to burn another micro SD. And what I did is I used this software called Amibian, which is you use it to transform your Raspberry Pi into an Amiga. And so basically you go through the steps, and there are a bunch of steps on YouTube on how to do it. However, it's kind of complicated. It's not just a drag and drop thing. You're going to have to get a USB drive and put a bunch of files on there. The other nice thing about Amiga Forever is it provides you with a lot of the stuff you're going to need to do that. And it provides you with files that are kind of copies of the hardware ROMs, read-only memory, integrated circuits. It provides you with software copies of those ROMs that you can just copy via USB over to your Raspberry Pi, and it will use it to start up your Raspberry Pi as an Amiga Workbench. And again, there's different versions it gives you. It gives you the different versions of ROM. And you're going to need some other data to do it. So you're going to have to go through a bunch of steps. So you're going to have to get this Amibian, and you're going to have to get the ROMs from Amiga Forever, and you're going to have to get some other stuff, and you're going to have to go through and do it. And it's a bunch of steps. And honestly, it's kind of annoying, So just keep in mind that these computers were designed for floppies, so you're going to have to go through the mechanics. If you have software, you're going to have to go through the mechanics of simulating, loading them via floppy, and it's a whole new set of procedures if you want to emulate a hard drive and figure out how to put your software on the hard drive so that it will load, and it gets really complicated really quickly. So it's so much easier to use this Amiga Forever and just start it up. But if you're determined to go through, you might want to go through with this, use this Amibian and Amiga Forever together and check some of the YouTube videos on how to set it up. And maybe just get a Raspberry Pi if you're not familiar with it, or you can install it on a virtual machine, or you can install it on an old piece of junk machine. So definitely I would suggest do the Amiga Forever. Step 2, if you want to get into the hardware, get in a little bit more depth and understand how all this works, go to use this Amibian and maybe install it on a Raspberry Pi or something so you can understand a little bit more depth of what all the files are and the ROMs and how it all works. And then once you understand all that, maybe start looking for some hardware if you really want to get into it. Just be very careful because you know, the hardware, a lot of it is, you know, the seller takes, the buyer takes all the risk. And you'll probably be taking some risk unless you can get with people who are familiar. Which is why I suggest you look around for maybe some Amiga users groups. I know there are a bunch around. There's some on the East Coast and the West Coast, and I'm sure there's others. So I suggest you might, you know, check some of the YouTube videos, check the user groups, and see if you can get some contact information, and just ask around. Say, hey, I want to get some hardware. What do you guys suggest that I do? So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on getting back into the old computer world. I hope it's been helpful. Take care. Have a really good day.